Lieutenant Colonel James had been stationed at camp for 3 years, and he thought he knew everyone worth knowing on the base. As one of the senior Marine Corps commanders, he carried himself with the confidence that came from years of service and multiple deployments. His morning routine was always the same: coffee at 500, briefings at 5:30, and a walk through the training facilities to check on his Marines. On this particular Tuesday morning in March, something was different. As he made his rounds through the administrative building, he noticed a woman in civilian clothes walking ahead of him in the hallway. She was of average height, maybe in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were unremarkable business casual attire, and she seemed to be studying the directory board near the main conference room. Approached with his usual authoritative stride, he had seen plenty of civilian contractors, military family members, and various personnel who visited the base regularly. This woman didn't look familiar, but that wasn't unusual. What caught his attention was how she seemed to be examining the building layout with what appeared to be a strategic eye, as if she was evaluating the facility rather than just trying to find her way. "Excuse me, ma'am," called out in his crisp military tone. "Can I help you find something? This area is restricted to authorized personnel only." The woman turned around slowly and noticed she had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything about him in a single glance. She smiled politely, but didn't seem intimidated by his commanding presence, which was unusual. Most civilians on base showed at least some deference to his rank and position. "I'm looking for Conference Room Alpha," she replied calmly. "I have a meeting scheduled there in 15 minutes. Glanced at his watch and then back at her civilian attire. "And you are?" "Sarah," she answered simply, extending her hand for a handshake. He shook her hand, nodding her firm grip, but something about her casual response irritated him. On his base, people usually provided more information about themselves, especially when questioned by a senior officer. "Ms., I'll need to see some identification. This is a secure facility, and I don't recognize you from any of the regular contractor groups." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out what appeared to be a standard military ID card, handing it to him without any sign of concern. Took the card and glanced at it quickly. What he saw made him do a double take, but in his hurried examination, he focused on the name and missed some crucial details. "Defense contractor?" he asked, handing the card back to her. "Something like that," replied with what would later realize was considerable restraint. As they stood there, found himself growing more frustrated with her vague responses. In his experience, contractors were usually eager to explain their credentials and show proper respect for military hierarchy. This woman seemed almost amused by his questions, which struck him as inappropriate given the setting. "Look, Ms., said, his voice taking on a slightly condescending tone, "I don't know what kind of meeting you think you're having, but around here we have protocols. We have chain of command. We have respect for rank and structure. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps, and when I ask questions, I expect complete answers." Nodded slowly, her expression remaining neutral. "I understand your position, Colonel." The fact that she knew his name without him introducing himself should have been a clue, but was too focused on what he perceived as her lack of proper deference. "Do you understand military hierarchy, Ms.? Do you know how things work in the Marine Corps?" "I have some familiarity with military structure," she replied evenly. Let out a small laugh that wasn't entirely friendly. "Some familiarity. Right. Well, let me explain something to you. In the Marines, we earn our positions through years of service, sacrifice, and dedication. We start at the bottom and work our way up through the ranks. Every promotion is earned through blood, sweat, and proving yourself worthy of increased responsibility." He gestured to the silver oak leaves on his collar. "These lieutenant colonel insignia represent 22 years of service to my country. I've commanded Marines in combat zones, led training operations, and earned the respect of every person under my command. That's how the military works. We don't just hand out ranks like participation trophies." Listened patiently, her hands clasped behind her back in what didn't recognize as a military parade rest position. "That's quite impressive, Colonel. 22 years is a significant commitment." "Exactly," continued, warming to his topic. "And that's why civilians sometimes don't understand the weight of military rank and responsibility. They see the uniforms and insignia, but they don't comprehend the journey it takes to earn them. They don't understand the sacrifices." He was getting carried away now, lecturing this unknown contractor about military values and hierarchy. Take general officers, for example. Four-star generals are the pinnacle of military leadership. There are only a handful in the entire Marine Corps at any given time. To reach that level requires decades of exceptional service, perfect performance evaluations, and the respect of both subordinates and superiors. Nodded thoughtfully. Four-star generals are indeed quite rare. Exactly, exclaimed. You can't just walk into the military and demand respect or claim authority. Rank is earned, not given. It's about proving yourself worthy of the trust that comes with command responsibility. As he spoke, noticed that a few other Marines had gathered in the hallway, apparently drawn by his passionate speech about military hierarchy. Staff Sergeant, whom had worked with for over a year, was among them, and he seemed to be staring at with an expression couldn't quite read. Colonel Staff Sergeant approached somewhat hesitantly. Sir, I believe you should know that. Not now, cut him off with a wave. I'm explaining to Ms. here about how military rank and respect work. Stepped back, glancing nervously between, and, yes, sir, of course, sir. Turned back to who was still listening with what seemed like infinite patience. The point is, Ms., when you come onto a Marine Corps base, you're entering our world. Our rules, our structure, our way of doing things. And in our world, rank means something. It's not just decoration or tradition. It's the foundation of how we operate effectively. I appreciate the explanation, Colonel, replied calmly. Military hierarchy is indeed fundamental to effective operations. Something in her tone made pause for a moment, but he was too invested in his lecture to stop now. Good. I'm glad you understand. Too many contractors come through here thinking they can operate however they want, without regard for military protocol. Glanced at her watch. Our meeting should be starting soon. Your meeting? Repeated with a slight smirk. And who exactly are you meeting with? Because if it's anyone in my chain of command, they should have cleared it with me first. I'm meeting with you, Colonel, replied quietly. Blinked in confusion. With me, I don't have any contractor meetings scheduled this morning. His expression didn't change. Perhaps you should check your calendar again. The meeting was arranged by Marine Corps headquarters in Washington. Now felt a flicker of uncertainty. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his digital calendar. Sure enough, there was a meeting scheduled for 800 hours in Conference Room Alpha with USMC Special Review. The notation was brief, and realized he had glanced at it earlier in the week but hadn't paid much attention to the details. Special Review, he asked, his confidence wavering slightly. Yes, confirmed. I'm here to conduct an assessment of base operations and command effectiveness. Stomach began to sink as the implications started to dawn on him. Assessment? What kind of assessment? The kind that Marine Corps headquarters orders when they want an independent evaluation of how things are running at the unit level. Explained, her voice still calm, but carrying a subtle authority that was finally beginning to recognize. Staff Sergeant cleared his throat. Sir, if I may. What is it? Snapped, his irritation now mixed with growing anxiety. Sir, I tried to tell you earlier. This is General Sarah. The words hit like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face as he looked back at, no, General, with new eyes. The confident posture, the way she had listened without defensiveness to his lecture about military hierarchy, the patience with which she had endured his condescending explanation of how rank worked in the Marines. General's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Nodded slightly. Brigadier General Sarah, Marine Corps, though as of last month it's actually Major General. His mind raced back through everything he had just said to her. His lecture about earning rank through years of service. His explanation of how four-star generals were the pinnacle of military leadership. His condescending tone when telling her that rank wasn't just handed out like participation trophies. Ma'am, I started to speak, but found himself unable to form coherent words. Colonel, General said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of command. Perhaps we should proceed to that meeting now. We have quite a bit to discuss about base operations and command effectiveness. As they walked toward Conference Room Alpha, his mind continued to replay every moment of their encounter. He had just spent 15 minutes lecturing a two-star general about military hierarchy and the importance of respecting rank. He had explained to her how generals earned their positions through decades of exceptional service, while completely failing to recognize that he was speaking to someone who had done exactly that. The other Marines in the hallway watched in stunned silence as followed General down the corridor, his face pale with the realization of what had just occurred. Staff Sergeant shook his head sadly, knowing that this was going to be a very long day for his commanding officer. As they reached the conference room door, General paused and turned back to, "Colonel, before we begin our formal meeting, I want you to know that your passion for military values and hierarchy is admirable. However, I think this morning has provided an excellent opportunity to discuss the importance of situational awareness and proper identification procedures." Could only nod, still struggling to process the magnitude of his mistake. He had wanted to teach a civilian contractor about military respect and protocol. Instead, he was about to learn some very difficult lessons about humility and attention to detail from one of the most senior officers in the Marine Corps. The conference room door closed behind them, and knew that his routine Tuesday morning had just become one of the most challenging days of his military career. Conference room Alpha felt smaller than usual as took his seat across from General. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to highlight every detail of what had just occurred in the hallway. Hands trembled slightly as he placed his notebook on the table, his mind still reeling from the realization that he had just given a lecture on military hierarchy to a two-star general. General sat down calmly, opening her briefcase and extracting several folders marked with official Marine Corps letterhead. Her movements were precise and professional, showing none of the uncertainty or deference that had mistakenly expected from a civilian contractor. As she organized her materials, found himself studying her more carefully, wondering how he could have missed so many obvious signs. "Colonel," General began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that only comes with years of command experience. "Before we discuss the official purpose of my visit, I think we should address what just happened in the hallway." His throat felt dry. "Ma'am, I owe you a profound apology. I had no idea who you were, but that's no excuse for my behavior." "You're right that not knowing my identity doesn't excuse your conduct," General replied evenly. "But I'm more concerned about the pattern of assumptions you made than the specific mistake of not recognizing me." She opened one of the folders and pulled out's personnel file, which was considerably thicker than he had expected. "Tell me, Colonel, what specifically made you assume I was a civilian contractor?" Struggled to answer honestly. "Ma'am, I suppose it was your clothing. You're in civilian attire, and most of the military personnel on base wear uniforms during duty hours." "And what else?" The question hung in the air, and realized she was pushing him to examine his own thought processes more deeply. I think I made assumptions based on your age and gender, ma'am, and I realize now how inappropriate that was." General nodded slowly. "At least you're being honest about it now. Tell me, when you looked at my military ID, what did you see?" Closed his eyes, trying to remember the brief moment when he had glanced at her identification card. "I saw your name and that it was a military ID, but I didn't look carefully at the rank or other details." "You saw what you expected to see," General corrected. "You had already decided I was a civilian contractor, so when you looked at my ID, you confirmed your preconception rather than actually reading what was in front of you." She pulled out a copy of her military identification and placed it on the table where could see it clearly. The rank designation, MG, was clearly visible, along with her service record number and other official markings that would have immediately identified her as a major general if had taken the time to look properly. "This is a significant problem, Colonel," General continued. "In your 22 years of service, you should have developed better observational skills and more careful attention to detail. These aren't just administrative matters, they're fundamental aspects of military competence." Nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. I failed to follow proper procedures." "But that's not the most serious issue we need to discuss," General said, her tone becoming more grave. "I'm more concerned about your attitude toward what you perceived as a civilian on your base." She opened another folder and began reading from what appeared to be notes she had taken during their hallway encounter. "You told me that civilians sometimes don't understand the weight of military rank and responsibility. You said that we don't just hand out ranks like participation trophies. You explained that rank is earned, not given." Winced as she repeated his own words back to him. Hearing them now, in the context of knowing who he had been speaking to, made them sound even more arrogant and condescending than he had realized at the time. All of those statements are true, Colonel, General continued. But the way you delivered them revealed some troubling assumptions about civilian contributions to military operations and about your own position in the military hierarchy. She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. Tell me, Colonel, what do you know about my background and how I earned my rank? Shook his head. Nothing, ma'am. I'm ashamed to admit that I know nothing about your service record. General opened another file and began to read. Enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1990 at age 18. Served as an enlisted Marine for 4 years before receiving a commission through the Enlisted Commissioning Program. Deployed to Somalia in 1993, Bosnia in 1996, Iraq in 2003 and 2005, Afghanistan in 2008 and 2011. Commanded at every level from platoon to regiment. Listened in growing horror as she continued reading her service record. Every deployment she mentioned was one he recognized as a significant military operation. Every command position represented years of proven leadership and combat experience. Graduated from the Naval War College, the Army War College, and the National Defense University, she continued. Holds a master's degree in strategic studies and a doctorate in international relations. Served as a military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and as a congressional liaison officer. The recitation of her accomplishments seemed to go on forever, each achievement highlighting the depth of mistake. This wasn't just any general. This was clearly one of the most accomplished and experienced officers in the Marine Corps. In 2020, I became the first woman to command a Marine expeditionary unit in combat operations, General concluded. I was promoted to Brigadier General in 2021 and to Major General in 2024. Next month, I'm scheduled to receive my 3rd star and assume command of Marine Corps Forces Pacific. Felt physically sick. He had lectured a 3-star general designate about how military rank was earned through years of service and sacrifice. He had explained to a combat veteran with multiple deployments how the military worked. He had condescended to an officer whose achievements far exceeded his own. Ma'am, I don't know what to say, managed. I've dishonored myself and embarrassed the Marine Corps. You've certainly made a serious error in judgment, General agreed. But what concerns me more is what this incident reveals about your leadership philosophy and your interactions with personnel you perceive as beneath your rank. She pulled out another document and recognized it as a copy of the base's recent climate survey results. Your Marines completed their annual climate survey last month. Would you like to guess what some of them said about your leadership style? His heart sank further. He had seen the survey results, and while they weren't terrible, there had been some comments about his communication style and approachability that had concerned him. Several Marines described you as condescending and dismissive, General read. One said you lecture people instead of listening to them. Another mentioned that you make assumptions about people's capabilities based on their appearance or background. Each comment felt like a punch to the stomach. Had always prided himself on being a strong leader, but hearing these criticisms in the context of what had just happened made him realize how blind he had been to his own behavior. But here's what really troubles me, Colonel, General continued. If this is how you treat a perceived civilian on your base, how do you treat your junior Marines? How do you interact with enlisted personnel who might not fit your expectations? How do you respond to Marines who are women or minorities or who come from backgrounds different from your own? Tried to answer, but found himself unable to speak. The question struck too close to home, forcing him to examine aspects of his leadership that he had never really considered before. I want you to think about Staff Sergeant, General said. He tried to tell you who I was, but you cut him off. You were so focused on your lecture about military hierarchy that you ignored input from one of your own Marines. What does that tell you about your listening skills? Remembered the moment clearly now. Had approached him with obvious urgency, trying to provide important information, but had dismissed him without even hearing what he had to say. It tells me that I've become arrogant and closed-minded, admitted quietly. I wasn't leading, I was just talking. General nodded. Leadership requires humility, Colonel. It requires the ability to listen, to question your own assumptions, and to recognize when you don't have all the information you need. What happened in that hallway wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was a demonstration of leadership failure. She closed the files and looked directly at. The reason I'm here, Colonel, is because Marine Corps Headquarters has received several informal complaints about the command climate at this base. Nothing that rises to the level of formal charges, but enough concerns about leadership effectiveness to warrant a personal assessment. Felt his career flashing before his eyes. "Ma'am, I had no idea that there were complaints." "That's part of the problem," General replied. "A good commanding officer creates an environment where Marines feel comfortable bringing concerns forward. When that doesn't happen, headquarters sometimes hears about problems through other channels." She opened her briefcase again and pulled out a thick folder labeled Assessment Report, Preliminary Findings. "I've been observing operations here for the past 3 days, Colonel. I arrived on Sunday and have been moving around the base in civilian clothes, talking to Marines at all levels, and observing how things work when senior leadership isn't watching." His mind raced as he tried to think back over the past few days. Had he seen her before and not recognized her? Had other incidents occurred that he was unaware of? "What you experienced with me this morning," General continued, "was not an isolated incident. I've observed similar patterns of behavior from you and some of your senior staff throughout the week. There's a disconnect between the leadership you think you're providing and the leadership your Marines are actually receiving." She opened the preliminary report and began reading specific examples. A Marine who had been dismissed for asking questions during a briefing. A female sergeant who had been overlooked for a training opportunity despite being the most qualified candidate. A junior officer who had stopped making suggestions during planning meetings because his ideas were consistently ignored. Each example felt like another indictment of leadership style. He began to see a pattern that he had been blind to: his tendency to make quick judgments about people, and then stick to those judgments regardless of evidence to the contrary. "The irony, Colonel," General said, looking up from her report, "is that you were absolutely right about everything you said regarding military rank and hierarchy. Rank is earned through years of service and sacrifice. It does require proving yourself worthy of increased responsibility. The problem is that you were lecturing these truths to someone who embodies them more completely than you do." Nodded, finally understanding the full scope of his failure. "Ma'am, what happens now?" General closed the report and leaned back in her chair. "That depends on you, Colonel. This assessment was ordered to determine whether leadership changes are needed at this base. Your performance over the next several weeks will determine whether you continue in command or whether Marine Corps Headquarters decides that a change is necessary." The weight of her words settled over like a heavy blanket. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for over 22 years of service, was now in jeopardy because of his arrogance and poor judgment. "However," General continued, "I believe in the possibility of growth and change. If you're willing to engage in honest self-reflection and make genuine changes to your leadership approach, there may be a path forward." Looked up hopefully. "Ma'am, I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "We'll see," General replied. "Because the real test isn't what you say to me in this conference room. It's how you behave when you leave here and face your Marines, knowing that they heard what happened in that hallway this morning." The conference room felt suffocating as sat in stunned silence after General's devastating assessment. The weight of 22 years of military service seemed to press down on his shoulders, but not in the way he had always imagined. Instead of feeling proud of his accomplishments, he felt the crushing realization that he had been failing his Marines and betraying the very values he claimed to represent. General gathered her papers methodically, her movements precise and professional. "Colonel, I want you to spend the rest of today reflecting on what we've discussed. Tomorrow morning at 700 hours, you will address your entire command staff about this incident and what you learned from it." His head snapped up. "Ma'am, you want me to tell them about what happened?" "Colonel, by now every Marine on this base has heard about your encounter with me in the hallway," General replied matter-of-factly. "Staff Sergeant wasn't the only witness. Word travels fast in military communities, especially when it involves a commanding officer making a significant mistake." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the training grounds where Marines were conducting their morning physical fitness routine. "You have two choices, Colonel. You can try to cover this up, make excuses, or minimize what happened. Or you can use this as an opportunity to demonstrate real leadership by taking full responsibility and showing your Marines how a leader responds to failure." Joined her at the window, watching the Marines going through their exercises with the discipline and dedication that he had always admired about the Corps. "What would you recommend, ma'am?" "I recommend honesty," General said simply. "Tell them exactly what happened. Explain the assumptions you made and why they were wrong. Acknowledge how your behavior reflected broader problems with your leadership approach, and then commit to doing better." She turned to face him directly. "But more importantly, Colonel, I recommend that you actually listen to what your Marines tell you in response. This can't just be a one-way apology. It has to be the beginning of a genuine conversation about how to improve the command climate here." Over the next hour, General outlined a comprehensive plan to rebuild trust with his Marines and address the leadership issues that had prompted her visit. The plan included regular town halls with enlisted personnel, mentoring sessions with junior officers, and a complete review of how decisions were made and communicated throughout the base. "You'll also be participating in a 360-degree leadership assessment," General explained. "Your Marines, your peers, and your superiors will all provide feedback on your leadership effectiveness, and you'll work with a military leadership coach to develop better listening skills and emotional intelligence." Nodded, understanding that this was both a lifeline and a challenge. "Ma'am, may I ask you something?" "Of course." How did you stay so calm when I was lecturing you about military hierarchy? How did you not lose your temper?" General smiled slightly, the first time had seen any warmth in her expression since they had entered the conference room. "Colonel, do you know how many times in my career I've been underestimated, dismissed, or lectured by someone who assumed I didn't belong? Do you know how many times I've had to prove myself because someone made assumptions about my capabilities based on my gender or my appearance?" Shook his head, beginning to understand the broader context of his mistake. "Every woman in military leadership has stories like this," General continued. "The difference is that most of us learn early in our careers to keep our composure, to choose our battles carefully, and to let our performance speak louder than our words." She sat back down and opened one of her folders again. "But here's what you need to understand, Colonel. My reaction this morning wasn't just about my own experience. It was about what your behavior revealed about how you might treat other people who don't fit your expectations. Marines who are women, minorities, younger personnel, or anyone who doesn't match your mental image of what a leader looks like." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with General providing specific examples of how could improve his leadership approach. She talked about the importance of active listening, of questioning his own assumptions, and of creating an environment where Marines felt safe to speak up when they disagreed with his decisions. "Leadership isn't about being the person in the room," General explained. "It's about bringing out the best in everyone around you. It's about recognizing that good ideas can come from anywhere, regardless of rank or background." As their meeting concluded, General stood and extended her hand for a handshake. "Colonel, I want you to know that I believe you can learn from this experience and become a better leader, but it will require genuine change, not just good intentions." Shook her hand, feeling the same firm grip he had experienced in the hallway, but now understanding it completely differently. "Ma'am, I won't let you down." "Don't worry about letting me down," General replied. "Worry about letting your Marines down. They're the ones who deserve better leadership." After General left, sat alone in the conference room for a long time, staring at the notes he had taken during their conversation. The weight of what he needed to do felt overwhelming, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a clear sense of direction. His first step was to find Staff Sergeant and apologize for cutting him off that morning. Found in the administrative office, working on training schedules for the upcoming month. "Staff Sergeant," called out, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Stood up and came to attention. "Yes, sir." At ease, said, "I need to apologize to you for this morning. You were trying to provide me with important information and I dismissed you without listening. That was wrong and it won't happen again." Looked surprised by the apology. "Sir, I understand you were focused on the conversation with the General." "That's no excuse," replied firmly. "You're one of my most experienced Marines and your input is valuable. I should have listened to what you had to say." Over the next several hours, sought out other Marines who had witnessed the morning's incident or who might have insights into the command climate issues that General had identified. Each conversation was difficult but enlightening, as Marines gradually opened up about their experiences and concerns. Sergeant Maria Santos, who worked in the communications section, mentioned that she had stopped volunteering for special assignments because she felt like her suggestions were always questioned more thoroughly than those of her male colleagues. Corporal James, a recent graduate of the basic school, explained that he had good ideas for improving training efficiency, but had been afraid to share them because seemed impatient with input from junior officers. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who had served under for 2 years, admitted that he had been considering requesting a transfer because he felt like his expertise was being underutilized. Each conversation revealed another aspect of his leadership failures, but also showed him how much potential existed within his command that he had been ignoring or suppressing. The next morning stood before his assembled command staff and senior enlisted personnel. The room was packed, and he could see the mixture of curiosity, concern, and skepticism on the faces looking back at him. "Marines," began, his voice steady but humble, "yesterday morning I made one of the biggest mistakes of my military career. I want to tell you about it, not because I enjoy admitting my failures, but because I think this experience can teach all of us something important about leadership and respect." He went on to describe the entire incident with General, leaving out no details and making no excuses for his behavior. He explained how his assumptions had blinded him to obvious facts, how his arrogance had prevented him from listening to input from his own Marines, and how his conduct had reflected poorly on the values of the Marine Corps. "The most important thing I learned yesterday," continued, "is that I haven't been the leader you deserve. I've been so focused on maintaining authority that I've forgotten that real leadership is about serving those under my command, not just expecting them to serve me." When he finished his account, opened the floor for questions and comments. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but he waited patiently, remembering General's advice about listening. Finally, Staff Sergeant spoke up. "Sir, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do about them." Sergeant Santos raised her hand. "Colonel, if you're serious about changing how things work around here, I'd like to talk to you about some ideas I have for improving our communications procedures." Corporal added, "Sir, I've been working on a proposal for modifying our training schedule to increase efficiency. Would you be willing to review it?" One by one, Marines began to offer suggestions, share concerns, and engage in the kind of constructive dialogue that realized had been missing from his command for years. The meeting ran for over 2 hours, but felt energized rather than drained by the discussion. Over the following weeks, implemented the changes that General had recommended and followed through on the commitments he had made to his Marines. He established regular office hours when any Marine could come to him with questions or concerns. He created a suggestion box system that allowed for anonymous feedback. He began delegating more responsibility to his junior officers and senior enlisted personnel. Most importantly, learned to listen. He stopped interrupting when Marines were speaking. He asked questions to understand their perspectives rather than to challenge their ideas. He admitted when he didn't know something and sought input from subject matter experts regardless of their rank. The transformation wasn't instant or easy. Caught himself falling back into old patterns several times and had to consciously correct his behavior. There were moments when he felt frustrated with the slower pace of decision-making that came with truly collaborative leadership. But the results spoke for themselves. Within 6 weeks, the base's climate survey scores showed significant improvement. Marines reported feeling more respected and valued. Productivity increased as good ideas were implemented regardless of their source. Several Marines who had been considering transfers decided to stay. 3 months after his encounter with General, received a call that she was returning to camp for a follow-up assessment. This time, when he saw her walking through the administrative building, he immediately recognized her rank insignia and approached with appropriate military courtesy. "General," said, saluting crisply, "welcome back to camp, ma'am." She returned his salute and smiled. "Colonel, I've been reviewing the reports from your base, and I'm impressed with the changes you've implemented." "Thank you, ma'am, but I have to credit my Marines for the improvements. They've shown me what real leadership looks like." General nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude, Colonel. Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating an environment where the best answers can emerge from your team." as they walked toward the conference room for their follow-up meeting, reflected on how much had changed since that humbling morning 3 months earlier. He was still a lieutenant colonel with 22 years of service, but now he understood that rank was not just about the authority it granted. It was about the responsibility to serve others and to constantly strive to become worthy of the trust placed in him. The encounter with General had been the most embarrassing moment of his career, but it had also been the most educational. It had forced him to confront his own arrogance and to rediscover the humility and dedication that had originally drawn him to military service. Knew that he still had work to do and more to learn about leadership. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly serving his Marines rather than just commanding them. And that, he realized, was what real military leadership was supposed to look like. General's final report recommended that remain in command, noting the dramatic improvements in unit morale and effectiveness. But more importantly, too, his Marines had begun to trust him again. They came to him with problems and ideas. They felt heard and valued, and they were performing at a level that made him proud to be their commander. The lesson that had hit like a thunderbolt that morning, that respect and authority must be earned every day through actions, not just granted by rank, had become the foundation of his transformed leadership philosophy. And every day, as he worked to live up to that standard, he was grateful for the general who had cared enough about his Marines to teach their commander what he needed to learn.